21A. 22A. Every morning I say this wrong. This thing in my head.
Just like the reader, when he looks at the page, what's going on?
Yeah. 22A. I don't know why that is. Keeps thinking in my head.
Consistency.
I'm sorry?
Consistency.
Yeah, every morning I consistently make the same mistake.
Sure.
Anyway, okay, we're 22A, and we are discussing this idea of making personal use of the mitzvah. Okay, I see I didn't print the next page, or did I? Didn't print the next page. Might be a little problem. So I'll just maybe. Anyway, okay. Just go for as far as we can. 22A towards the bottom, and we're trying to understand this notion of the mitzvah and making use of the mitzvah on a personal level. We talked about different levels of holiness retained by mitzvahs, whether the object itself becomes holy in perpetuity, like tefillin, or the object is holy, the object is the object of a mitzvah, so long as the mitzvah is being performed, like a lulav on Sukkot, or whether it's an object with which a mitzvah is being done, like the blood used to cover, the blood that we cover, and like the oil that we light the menorah with, in which it's not the object itself is not the object of a mitzvah, but it's an object with which we're doing a mitzvah, because the mitzvah is the lighting, right? And then the other level, what we discussed yesterday, is the new level we were introduced to yesterday, is things that adorn the mitzvah, in which case it itself is not the object of the mitzvah. It's not even something I do the mitzvah with, but it's something that I've dedicated to beautify a mitzvah. Noi sukkah is the example we're given, things that are hung in the sukkah to make the sukkah more beautiful. Ornaments, decoration. It's not part of the actual sukkah. The sukkah would be kosher without it, but there are things that I've dedicated to be in the service of making that mitzvah beautiful, and therefore get some sort of holiness. We compared this to tefillin bag. It's not part of the actual mitzvah, but it's an object that I've dedicated, huktzah. It's the word muktzah, comes from that word. I've dedicated to be in the service of a mitzvah, even though it itself is not a mitzvah. Okay, so now we're getting back to the menorah lighting specifically, and trying to further get to details about what's its holiness and how and when it can be used. So it says the Gemara as follows. So it's 3 lines up from the narrow set of lines. The line begins with the word Amar of Yosef, and then the last word on that line after the colon is Itmar. Itmar. The following is a teaching we've received, but when the Gemara introduces it with the word Itmar, it means it's a teaching from the post-Mishnaic age, from the Gemara age, Ramaroyim. And given the people that are speaking, it's quite early on in the Gemara age, and therefore the Gemara, I suppose, some 200 years later, is saying, here's a teaching we've received down the line. Right? As we talked before, the Mishnah is a hodgepodge of conversations that have gone on for 400 years. So Itmar, sometimes they're saying, we received this following teaching. Rav Amar Rav said, Ein madlikin min ner lener. One is not allowed to light one candle from another candle. We're going to qualify this soon, what that means. But for now, let's just say that you have your menorah light. You're not allowed to use it to light some other light. It's an object of a mitzvah. And again, it's an object with which you are doing a mitzvah.
Even on the same menorah.
We're going to get there. The Gemara is going to qualify that in a minute. That's why I said we'll leave that for now. But for now, let's just say like this: you're not allowed to light from one candle to another candle. You cannot take the menorah lights and use and relight anything else with it. We're going to qualify exactly in a moment soon whether we're talking about a different menorah or we're talking about a personal candle. But for now, let's just say Rav is saying you're not allowed to light any candles using the lights of the menorah, because it's an object with which I did a mitzvah, not respectful. Oh, well, let's just get to the why soon. I shouldn't say that either. Okay. Rav's opinion, clear? Okay. Shmuel Amar, Shmuel says, Madlikin, you may light one candle from another. You may light one candle from one of the other candles on the menorah. So what's the root of this dispute? Before we get to that, the Gemara is going to list 2 other disputes, even though they aren't related directly to the menorah. And the reason why they're quoted is because, as we're going to conclude, the halacha is that the principle in halacha is that we always follow Rav, when it comes to a certain set of laws, which Chanukah is in that category. When it comes to a certain set of laws, we always follow Rav when he's disputing with Shmuel. Rav and Shmuel are common disputants. They were colleagues and disputants. They had ran different yeshivas later, but they earlier learned together. Both under Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi, different people, but they learn together and they are disputants. So the rule is we always follow Rav in a certain set of laws, with the exception of 3 cases where we follow Shmuel, not Rav. And this is one of the 3 cases where Rav says you're not allowed to light one candle from the other. Shmuel says you are allowed to. Halacha is you may. So because we're now quoting this anomaly in which we follow Shmuel rather than Rav, the Gemara is going to quote 2 other cases that are also part of this anomaly, which we follow Shmuel and not Rav. Clear? Says the Gemara. Second case number 2. Rav says, Ein matirin tzitzis mi beged lebeged. You may not untie the tzitzis that are hanging on one garment and tie them to another garment, right? The biblical commandment is that whenever you have a garment of 4 corners or more, you attach fringes, you attach strings. That's the halacha. So the halacha, the mitzvah is not to wear a talis. The mitzvah is, when you have a cloth of 4 garments, make sure you have your strings attached to it. Now, when you daven, especially when you say the Shema, and in the Shema, the 3rd chapter describes tzitzis. So it's the language in the halacha is meyed eid sheka ba'atzmai. It's like you're lying about yourself when you read a commandment about tzitzis and you're not wearing tzitzis. And therefore, it's become kind of a halacha that during davening one should wear tzitzis, which is why we put on the talis to daven. Right? Talis just means a cloth. That's all talis means, or a cloak, more accurately translated. It means a cloak. And it's a cloak that has 4 corners, and therefore it's a cloak that has to have 4 strings at the corners. And because you're saying Shema in your prayer, and by extension, in some ways, all of davening, and even other things like getting an aliyah, one should have that mitzvah on them, one should have this tzitzis. But biblically speaking, if a person doesn't have a 4-cornered garment, one's not required to wear tzitzis. Biblically speaking. Nonetheless, as we learn in the Rambam, and the Shulchan Aruch, and other places, that one should have that mitzvah on their person the entire time, and therefore we have what's called the talis katan, the small talis. That is to say, a small cloth that I'm wearing under my shirt right now, which has 4 corners, and on it there are 4 corners. The point I'm making here is related to this discussion is that the mitzvah itself is not the cloth. The mitzvah itself is the strings. And therefore Rav is saying, undo the tzitzis, that cloth, I don't know, do whatever you want with it, doesn't matter, and then take the tzitzis and attach it to another cloth. Because you're not misappropriating the mitzvah, you're just transferring it. Rav, I'm sorry, not Shmuel. Rav is saying don't do that. Rav is saying don't do that. It's disrespectful to this, I'm sorry, I'm mixing up, yeah. Rav says it's disrespectful to this cloth to take away its mitzvah. This is a cloth with which a mitzvah was done, it's disrespectful to take it away. Just like this is a mitzvah, this is a candle with which a mitzvah is done, don't light another candle from it. Even though the mitzvah is not the light, the mitzvah is the lighting, the act. Nonetheless, this is an object with which a mitzvah was done. Don't use it for yourself, don't undo it, or don't ruin it, as it were, by lighting another candle. But same thing with a cloth. This is a cloth with which a mitzvah was done, even though it itself is not a mitzvah, and therefore don't take it off. Even though the tzitzis themselves, even though the mitzvah themselves, the object of the mitzvah, the actual strings, are going to be reused somewhere else. But it's not nice to the cloth with which the mitzvah was done. Yeah, what were you saying?
I was going to say, maybe there was something defective about other issue defective about
that cloth. Okay, so the garment becomes defective, that's a good question, and the halacha changes, but we don't follow Rav anyway. We follow Shmuel, but there's all kinds of detailed laws about how it rips and when when you're allowed to put it back together, and if you can't put it back together, can you transfer it, can you not transfer it? Very complicated set of laws, because there's other principles also. For example,
well, isn't it the whole thing, if it damages one of the corners specifically, and then it loses its 4-corner status as a garment, then you're allowed to take off it to send them to another 4-corner garment?
Well, we rule like Shmuel that you're allowed to anyway. Yeah. But the question becomes if you're allowed to reattach them. It's very complicated because there's 2 things. First of all, there's something called tasav lemon also, which means you cannot have a pre-made pair of tzitzis if they actually put the tzitzis on. So the classic example is, if I have a string tied to the cloth, let's say there's a garment that only has 1 corner, not 3, not 4. The other 3 are rounded. So I put a tzitzis on one of the 4 corners, and then I cut out, and then I put tzitzis on all 4 corners, 3 of them being rounded, and then I straighten them out. So I never put the tzitzis onto a cloth that requires tzitzis. I put the tzitzis onto a cloth that doesn't require tzitzis, and only afterwards it became required in tzitzis. So at the moment when the obligation arrived, the tzitzis were already there. So it's already pre-made tzitzis, rather than placing the tzitzis on, right? And that's one principle number 1. Another principle is, Vasisam oisam, al kanfe b'gdeim, which is that the cloth that I put the tzitzis on to have to be large enough to require tzitzis when I put them on. And therefore, if I'm ripping tzitzis and I'm reattaching them, it gets into how big is that rip, how big is that corner, and can I reattach it? It's very complicated to the laws. Well, let's just pin in that. Okay, so case number 1 was machlekes. Shmuel says you may light one candle with another candle on Chanukah. Rav says no. Case number 2 is Rav says you may not remove the tzitzis from one garment and put it onto another garment because you are now disrespecting the original garment with which a mitzvah was done, even though the garment itself is not the object of the mitzvah. And Shmuel said, "Matirim beged lebeged." Shmuel says you may take tzitzis off one garment and put it on another. And again, this is the halacha. Even though usually we follow Rav, here we're following Shmuel. Case number 3, Rav Amar ein halacha k'Shmuel begreira, k'Shimon begreira, or Shmuel Amar halacha k'Shimon begreira. So there's a machlekes in the laws of Shabbos, which is if I'm doing a action that's permissible on Shabbos, and inadvertently a prohibition is done. So is that permissible or not permissible? The classic example is I am dragging a bench. Now why am I dragging the bench? Because I need it in another place, and that's completely perfectly fine. I need the bench in such and such location, so I'm moving it over. But while I'm moving it over, I am dragging it on the floor and making a furrow in the ground. And making a furrow in the ground is a derivative of chodesh, like plowing, which I'm not allowed to. So if I intended, when I drag the bench, if I intended to make a furrow in the ground, then everybody would agree that that's forbidden. I'm making a furrow in the ground. But here I'm dragging the bench for the sake of the bench. And by the by, there happens to be a furrow. Some dispute between the sages and Rabbi Shimon. Now Rav says we follow the sages, which is you're not allowed to. You're not allowed to drag that bench if inadvertently a furrow will be made, even though you didn't want the furrow. And Shmuel says you may, and Halacha follows Shmuel.
Because he didn't have the intent.
Correct. It's only in a case though where it's a lighter bench. If it's a very, very heavy bench in which it's unavoidable, then even Shmuel would agree, even Rabbi Shimon would agree that it's forbidden. But if it's a lighter, thinner bench where it's not as if I'm dragging it deeply in the ground, it just happens to be making it, then it's allowed.
Also, even if you don't even use the furrow, because obviously
Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. The question is your intention.
Yeah.
Unless it's to such a degree, right?
Unless it's, yeah.
The consequence is certain to happen.
Exactly. So how you define certainty is a good question, and that's discussed. But yes, you're right. If the bench is heavy enough that it's absolutely certain it's going to make a deep furrow, then it's forbidden even according to Shimon. Okay, so these are the 3 disputes between Rav and Shmuel. And Amar Abaye says, and this is what I mentioned earlier, Kol Muli Demar, everything at master, my teacher, who Rashi tells us is, where is that? Rabbi Bar Nachmoni. So Abaye says, all the things my teacher, my master, Rabbi Bar Nachmoni would do, Avid Kerav, he would follow Rav in all areas. Lavar Mahani Tlas, with the exception of these 3 laws, the Avid Kishmul, in which we did like Shmuel, which is why the Gemara bunches all these 3 together. Because all these 3 are the exception in which we followed Shmuel. Okay. Namely, Madlikim Ner Laner, you're allowed to light one light from another light from your Chanukah candles. Matirim Beged Lebeged, you may undo tzitzis from one cloth and put it onto another cloth, with another garment. V'alach Reb Shimon Greda, and Allah follows Reb Shimon. With respect to the law of dragging a bench, in that if it inadvertently makes a furrow, it is permissible. And the Gemara now introduces that case. Tanya, as we read, Rabbi Shimon says, "Go to other mita kiseh safsel." A person is allowed to drag on Shabbos a bed, chair, or bench, so long as he does not intend for the resulting furrow, and the furrow happens inadvertently, then it's permissible. And this Abaye says is the way my teacher Bar Nachmoni would practice, following Shmuel in these 3 cases, unlike everywhere else, follow like Rav, and that remains the actual halacha. Okay, we'll stop over here, and God willing, tomorrow we're going to get into what's the reasons for the machlekes of Rav and Shmuel, specifically with the case of the menorah, and that's going to help us further define exactly what this means, that the mitzvah of the menorah is the act, not the result, A, B, and what it means to respect an object with which a mitzvah is done, even though the object itself isn't the mitzvah. Right? The object isn't the mitzvah, the candle is not the mitzvah is the act done with that candle, the lighting. but nonetheless have to give it some respect, as we learned yesterday. So once we understand the reasons for Rav and Shmuel, we'll understand that even more deeply. We'll understand more clearly and more deeply this idea that A, the mitzvah is the act, not the result, while simultaneously B, I have to be respectful to the result, even though that wasn't the mitzvah. Because it's an object with which the mitzvah was done. And that, God willing, coming tomorrow. A wonderful day, everybody. And a freilichen last 2 days of Chanukah.